Welcome to Continuous Identity Sessions, where we connect the brightest minds in identity with the strategies and real-world approaches that make IAM work better. I'm still your host and fellow continuously curious identity nerd, Dustin Avol, and we've been lucky enough in our inaugural season, Season 1, to sit down with the people building and managing identity at enterprise scale. They've figured out how to eliminate bottlenecks, reduce manual work, and implement automation to actually improve security without slowing down businesses. These people are doing really cool and interesting stuff, and we want to talk to them. We've gotten to over the past few months. We've talked with 15 industry experts, identity strategists, OpenID Foundation leaders, former Gartner analysts, Fortune 500 practitioners, and consultants who work with hundreds of organizations. We've covered everything from continuous identity fundamentals to machine identity challenges to securing AI agents. And some clear themes have started to emerge about what's actually working, what enterprises are prioritizing. Hey, where is the industry even heading? Today, once again, we are lucky enough to be joined by Ian Glazer, who kicked off Season 1 with Episode 1. And he's going to help us synthesize what we've learned. We'll cover some of the key frameworks that emerged, as well as the practical guidance that came up repeatedly, and what we're hearing from identity teams about their priorities for the next year. Ian, welcome back to wrap up Season 1, and thank you for being back. It's
my God,
to see you.
I'm so stoked for this. I can't believe how much fun Season 1 was to watch as an observer, right? It was great. I was on the first episode, what have you. But just seeing the number of people that came through, the kinds of folks that came through, this was awesome. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, you started with Episode 1. What the heck is continuous identity? Great place to start. And you're the first super fan, I'm going to say, of the continuous identity sessions. So we had to bring you back. I'm here in the home court. I've got a little change of venue, which feels comfortable. It's great to be back. It's great to see you, and we can kick off with some of the insights that we talked about with many of the episodes.
Sure.
And the guests. One of them was about sort of how you start, how to get things going, and this was a thread that we pulled through every episode from almost every guest. You in Episode 1 to Lori Robinson in Episode 9. Everyone was emphasizing starting small rather than trying to boil the ocean. It feels like it's the most important practical guidance from the entire season. I think you even said, pick one piece of context. That seems like some of the most actionable advice to start with. Why is starting small so critical for continuous identity adoption?
I think there's two reasons. The first is that the impact that you can have with just a single piece of context, just a small application of the principles, is unbelievably oversized, right? That you can put into practice some of these continuous identity concepts, like pulling in real-time context, like applying just a little bit more to the policies that would govern critical access. And suddenly you find the side effects are like, oh, wait a minute, I don't have to do access certification for 100 people 4 times a year for critical access, and I've limited my blast radius, and I've removed standing access. Like, that's huge. So in some regards, the start small with just something simple is like, don't be greedy, right? Like, you're going to get so much out of this and you're not going to believe it. But the other thing is, and maybe this is a bit of the salty veteran in me, is let's set expectations really reasonably, right? What you as an identity practitioner are about to propose to your superiors, your peers, the lines of business, the CISO is like, I'm going to take a different approach that is really unlike things we've done in the past, but has similarities, right? It sort of rhymes with what we've been doing, augments what we've been doing, but I'm going to get all of these outcomes out of it. Now, if you paint the picture of like the total rollout, they're going to be like, that's ridiculous. That's not a thing. You can't do that. Not for that budget. Like, no way, no how. So in some regards, the start small is also look, you can wow them starting really, really small. And that's amazing. That is unlike what we have seen in the past with some of these very large scale identity programs. And especially to customers such as the CISO and the security organization, I think it's a great way to win a ton of credibility and know in your back pocket, oh man, if they like this first act, they're not going to believe what we can do in use case 2 and use case 3. So there's a little bit of gamesmanship in this as well, but I think it's worth it, right? Because you can actually build a lot of goodwill because you can lead to great outcomes just starting small.
You mentioned a couple of things that some of our guests talked about. Darren Rolls, I think he actually said augment and overlay, choose the easy stuff. And Sean O'Dell said to start with some of the smallest, most achievable thing with metrics. So right there, you talk about two of the pieces that you were just explaining, proving some value by augmenting slightly what you already have.
Yep.
And then also, you want to get buy-in, right? Because you want, like you said, you have a greater plan in mind. So you need some of those metrics too, right?
Yeah, you absolutely do. And I mean, let's be honest, like if you're watching this, you're an identity practitioner, you kind of know one of the dirty secrets in the industry, which is there is literally nothing more boring than an identity management demo. Like there's literally nothing more boring. It's like, okay, I click on this and I'm logged in. Ta-da! And yet behind the scenes, all of these amazing things happen. Like, oh, for the first time ever, we considered the posture of the device I'm coming from, as well as the state of our ITSM systems, whether I'm supposed to have access to something. Like we could never do that before. So that kind of boring login demo is hugely impactful from risk mitigation perspective, or the ability to reduce access review, access cert, what have you. But I think to your question about the metric side of things, one thing I've been thinking about, and I want to be sort of talking more about publicly next year, is how do we really think about reducing access exposure, right? We talk about limiting blast radius. We talk about removing standing access, but I actually think we can turn that into a hard number that we can report on, we can benchmark against. We can slice it by carbon-based life forms and silicon-based life forms. We can slice it by criticality of system protected. Like, I think there's something there in sort of measuring actual elapsed exposure time for access that's standing. So those critical production entitlements, we know, you and I both know, well, you shouldn't leave those things laying around for a variety of reasons. But we can actually turn that gut of like, you shouldn't leave those laying around to actually hard numbers that you can actually use to compare and measure your maturity. So that's something I'm really keen to start talking more about next year, which is, oh my God, in 3 weeks. But it's one place where we can go from metrics that sort of talk about our own progress, how many systems under management, how many password resets were deflected by a bot, things like that, to actually some hard stats that, for example, the CISO and likely even a subcommittee of the board's going to want to see.
It's a good segue into what I'm calling one of our number 2 key insight. That's about data. Shockingly, spoiler alert, not really shockingly, data came up in almost every episode, from you talking about fine data is just fine and advising to embrace imperfect data and just start, to Jeff Stedman saying you can't do continuous identity without data, and Sean talking about data hygiene being critical for AI. How is data in that context different from the single piece of context to start with that we talked about in the previous insight? Is it different? Is it the same thing?
There's two different things going on, right? One is the continuous acknowledgement that data quality for the kinds of identity data that our IAM infrastructure operates on is of questionable quality and has been since the beginning of time. Now, partially it's because it's not actually our data, right? As an identity practitioner, the data we're operating on it's HR data. It is application specific information. It is things that are owned by the lines of business. It's not necessarily, if you will, first party data for the identity teams. We have those in our reporting platforms, things of that nature. So it's not really our data. And so in that regard, it's not optimized for us. And so you have heard throughout literally decades, like data quality is such a big issue, and it absolutely is. But one of the keys to this is acknowledging it's not ours. And so we could go tilt at windmills to say, hey, line of business, you've really got to go clean up your Salesforce data. that is a conversation that will be met with varying degrees of belly laughter, right? It's going to be like, look, you're going to get what you're going to get. And that's not great, but it's manageable. So the Seans and the Jeffs of the world have sort of powered through that to say, like, yes, it's not great. There's things we can do to make it easier to ingest this data, to clean up this data, to know sort of who our polluters are, if you will, with the least quality data, and then understand where we get some of the best. But the other point is that, and by the way, that has never stopped us, right? Like, an identity program has acknowledged, like, look, this is tough, especially when there are multiple systems doing the same thing. Like, you talk to organizations like, oh, we have 7 HR systems. You're like, oh my gosh. You got to synthesize that somehow. And people do that and have done that over the years. It's not easy, but it can get done. The thing about it is that at certain scale, you don't need to, right? You mentioned it up front, Dustin, that we're talking to organizations, practitioners, they're in the Fortune 50 and doing this. And at their scale, that's a really hard problem, but they also have sort of resources and expertise to do that. If you start at this small scale, if you go back to the thing we just talked about, like starting really small on a narrow focus to say, look, I care about who's checking in code to production. If that's what my concern is, my world is, just to begin, then the problem of data is a much smaller one in and of itself too, right? I think sometimes we take a really wide view about thinking about data across the whole enterprise. I'm like, oh my God, this thing isn't just, I'm never going to get my arms around it. And you might not, but as you winnow down and say, like, yeah, but what's the real critical thing I want to protect today? What's the real critical thing I want to demonstrate today? Data quality is actually not as bad as you might think. So with that, then you add that one more piece of context, right? You add, whether it's your endpoint posture or it's your ITSM system status, ticket status. And I've said this over again, and I will continue to do so, is that domain specific information is good for that domain, right? Like, the stuff coming out of ITSM tickets, we understand what they are, and it's reasonably normalized, and we can understand effectively the quality of it because it powers a whole bunch of other stuff other than identity related things. Same story with that posture management, same story with that device management data. So really the hard part is drawing the connection between those kinds of disparate data and the identity data that we've got, no matter how meager it is. But nice thing is you can do that. And once you've done that, you can, again, at that small scale, make a real impact. So that contextual information that's really, really powerful for identity infrastructure, the good news is it's pretty good for the domain that it's in. And if we can draw a connection to it, we can get value from it.
And Felix, in episode 2, Felix Gakins expounded and was talking about how contextual signals are critical for the dynamic patterns that we're trying to enact or enable through all this. So it really does seem like the realistic data quality bar for getting started, if I can call it that, is low. And you said, like I mentioned, you said imperfect data, and you also were just talking about the areas, the domains to leverage it. It feels like maybe this is a paralysis analysis risk where folks are too concerned with getting it just right before they get started. Are you seeing anything like that as well?
I don't necessarily want to go that route because, I am always suspicious of, sort of blaming the identity practitioner for not, focusing hard enough on it. And I actually think one of the reasons why this becomes a thing, and it can take the shape of analysis paralysis, I think, is this. Us practitioners, we look at this and go, all right, well, cool. I can do this use case. Got it. Business level, sort of this division, these applications, I can solve that problem. But we're always in our head going, how the hell do I scale this thing up? How do I make this an enterprise solution? How do I make this a multi-geography solution? How do I make this a multi-system type solution? And we have been bit multiple times on the backside by identity programs that 3 years in, and we're still not really to where we need from a coverage perspective and an efficacy perspective. And so I think there's a little frankly, multiple times bitten, very shy sort of reaction to this. So it's not that people don't want to start. I see people really keen to try to dig in on some of these things and try to apply continuous identity principles and design, but they've got a lot of heritage with kind of multi-year, really challenging, low outcome programs, and they just don't have the heart to mount another assault on that thing again, and rightly so. Like, that's kind of a miserable slog. I think the thing that, if you're listening to this, these sort of start with a simple piece of context, start with a small use case, is really it's like a mental palate cleanser of all of a sudden, like, there's this other world that exists. You're not really going to believe it until you do it once. And then you're going to be like, oh my gosh. And so, as opposed to worrying in the moment about how to scale this up in n number of dimensions, try a little something and you're going to be like, wow, okay, I get it. Now I can go start. Now with more open eyes, I can think about, look at this impact, these outcomes. That's going to give me, in some regards, mandate to get improved data quality, to get the resources we need to bring more data together to actually make these decisions.
Yeah. Well, and if we move along to one of the next key insights, it fits right in with what you've been talking about. You already mentioned it, actually, because most people have mentioned it. We actually did an episode with Lori Robinson almost entirely on it, that real time doesn't mean ripping and replacing what you've already done. We already have. You don't have to throw out your existing IAM investments. Jim, Jeff, Darren, you, Eric, and Matt called this building upon layers of archaeology. But I'm going to take this a different direction.
Okay.
You talked about some of the legacy approaches, and I'm wondering, how do customers justify not ripping and replacing by adding another solution? Here's another way to skin this cat. Here's we have this, we have X, Y, Z. We also need A, B, and C. Why isn't rip and replace a reasonable strategy?
I think it's partially because we've had such long sort of deployment times, and not just deployment, but times to real outcomes, especially in the IGA and PAM spaces. It's just been so, frankly, hard. And a lot of times the outcomes that people were looking for were very much purely compliance driven, right? I need to see N number of systems that are SOX material under governance by this date. And it is just a slog to get there. And having gone through that once or twice or three times, you're just not going to have the like energy to be like, oh, cool. I'm sure the fourth time will be different, right? Like, and so there is no pragmatic need in a lot of cases to say, I'm going to pitch out the IGA system. Why? Because the progress that we have made with it is giving me provisioning, lifecycle provisioning capabilities across a swath of impactful systems. Why would I throw the baby out with the bathwater? I can use that, but I can actually supercharge it using continuous identity to actually make it more real time, that we're not just beholden to join, move, leave as the sort of 3 times a day that we can actually go do something. You might as well, as our friends over the UK would say, sweat the assets down a little bit more, allow you to get more out of the gains that you've already had, because those are important gains. They may not feel like, oh man, we haven't gotten to the nth corner of the enterprise and covered everything. Yeah, but you have made real progress, and that's really meaningful. And that's important. You might as well take advantage of it.
Can you started to mention it, I wanted to go here, but can you expound upon either where the traditional legacy approaches or systems, or specifically IGA and PAM, sort of still fit with the relationship to continuous identity?
Yeah. Well, I mean, first and foremost, they can coexist quite happily in any of these environments, right? Whether you're thinking about regulatory compliance, business productivity, what have you. And the reason to have them coexist is for pragmatic ones within an enterprise, right? A large enterprise, even a medium enterprise, it's a complex place. There's humans involved, which means that there's politics and necessarily not aligned priorities and shifting budgets. And so any progress that organizations have made, it's worth taking a look at and saying, like, can we get more out of this by adding something else to it versus saying, all right, I'm going to go write up a new justification for, we're going to do this again. And there's a real human cost to that. And I don't mean from like, hey, we need more FTEs to go do the work. I mean, you as like a lead identity practitioner, like you're drawing down on your political capital if you want to go do that thing again. Now, the other side of the ledger is, well, we're going to add another vendor. Procurement always loves that. They're super big fans of that. And we're going to make this case. Well, you know what? The way we're going to make this case this time, it's how one of our friends of the show talks about this on stage. He'll put up a slide with dozens and dozens of logos of security and identity technology and be like, my organization has at least one of everything on this slide. The reality is that none of it talks to each other. So if you can put something in place that actually pulls salient information from those different sources and makes it available to enhance what you're doing in identity, then in some regards, yeah, you are absolutely adding one more logo to that slide. But if what you're adding is really the connective tissue, the long missing connective tissue for your enterprise identity first security, that's a huge, huge lift from an outcomes perspective. You're going to get more out of these things. And I think that's an argument you can make very comfortably with security peers, with your business peers. We're going to get more out of what we got. We'll start moving budget from some of these programs into this. Over time, we may draw them down to zero. We may not, right? It depends on how we're doing against our stated goals and our priorities. But it gives us an opportunity to first recoup more value from what we've already got and then right size what we've deployed.
I think it was Darren who mentioned really overlaying, excuse me, policy and context onto existing systems. Is policy and context kind of the fabric or the connective tissue that you're talking about for some of those legacy systems?
It's definitely the way we both express the outcome that we want, right? We want to refine who's getting access. How do we use that to remove standing access? And the context side of it is that sort of grist for the mill. It's the gas for the engine of saying like, this is what's going to make things different this time. And it doesn't have to necessarily be just legacy systems, right? We can use this to say, I can make my existing access request process for our hyperscalers more effective and less burdensome on the people that are having to approve this stuff. That's a win, right? So it's not just about addressing legacy infrastructure. It's about even fitting into, frankly, somewhat legacy processes and making them a little bit less burdensome.
Yeah, I mean, it's a maturity model, right? And you talked a little bit about a metric for maturity, but it's definitely a direction or directional maturity, if nothing else. One of the pieces that sort of maintains throughout that maturity, or is common throughout any sort of industry maturity or approach, is what we talked about as our next insight: standards. Avol, our colleague and OpenID chair, a big fan of standards, and we've talked about quite a few here. Shared signals, including CAPE, MCP, auth-zen. They continuously, no pun intended, come up as the engine that really drives continuous identity to be possible at the enterprise scale. So I'll just bluntly ask, why are standards important in continuous identity?
So I think, especially for continuous identity, one of the things that we see is that we're at the point of the story where we've invented a telephone and now everybody needs one. So we think about shared signals and the shared signals framework as essentially establishing the early days of a telephone network. Now, we know that there's all sorts of value that we can have once we get one of these things because we've sort of lived through that process. We also know that the amount of standardization that needs to go into this, both in terms of what flows across the wire and the devices themselves, but also sort of the business practices around them, we still need to mature a lot of that. But we're in that phase of like, everyone needs a telephone. SSF gives us a way to do that. So the shared signals framework gives us a way to do that. And when we get there, What it does primarily is two things. Standards de-risk deployments, full stop, right? The ability to say, I can plug into this existing infrastructure because it speaks SCIM, it speaks SSF, it speaks OIDC. Whatever it is, it starts to de-risk the deployment. Now, I know there are some cynics listening to this, and they're gonna be like, yes, but everyone has their own slightly different flavor. That's true. What we often find, not speaking just of SSF, but generically speaking, like, hey, how you deployed this or deployed that, there's variances for certain. And often there's a use case reason for that, right? There's a real business reason sometimes for that. But even in the, with those sort of challenges added to it, if you removed standards, the amount of labor involved in building connectivity, in building identity infrastructure is enormous. Those of us who have been around the provisioning space for a long time, before we had SCIM, before we had SPML, before we had DSML, like all of this was hand-coded API stuff, and it was a mess to maintain. And so first thing to take away, if you're maybe in fact newer to the practice, to identity, is that standards de-risk your deployments. With that in place, then we can start to build the components that make the more complicated use cases possible. So I'll give you an example. In the shared signals framework, there's two profiles. One's risk, which has to do with really user account telemetry, and then there's CAPE, which is really about session telemetry. Well, there's more to life than just those two things. In fact, that is not both kinds of music, country and Western. There's more that we can do there. But the nice thing is that within shared signals framework, there is the security event token. This is the sort of underlying format of how we move information around. We can put other kinds of things in there, which means we can start to build profiles, they call them in the standards world, of other kinds of use cases. Like, for example, I want to put fraud information in there. I want to put IP intelligence information in there. We can actually start to grow those things, but we can do them based off of standards. And then it just works inside of a standards adherent infrastructure. And that's a really important thing, because it means that the innovation that technology vendors have, that other enterprises have, heck, even your competitor has, to push what these standards can do, you can benefit from. And that's an enormous, enormous force multiplier.
Yeah, Sean was talking about how SSF specifically can really help drive interoperability and scalable trust, just like you were saying. There's still some mention of proprietary signals or information, and that standards can reduce the need for those proprietary integrations. That's how Felix discussed it. Atul and Scott, specifically, we're talking about MCP and standardizing how AI is accessing that enterprise data. But from what I'm hearing from you and all these different guests, is that the scale that standards can unlock is sort of unmatched.
The alternative is a whole lot of point-to-point, a whole lot of custom, and a whole lot of tech debt, future tech debt. No one's got the appetite for that, right? And that is the pace at which continuous identity can allow us to operate. That sort of tech debt heavy, proprietary heavy approach is just antithetical to it. But Sean's right. Like, you're not going to have standards everywhere. And even when you do, there's going to be quirks. It's always quirks. But the alternative is unsustainable and frankly unfundable. So the nice thing is that you can mix and match. And so this is the interesting part of certainly, how we approach things, and others are like, it's great. We've got standards to help you do these things and do these things faster. Awesome. However, we're individuals of action, and we know that not everywhere we're going to get that. That's fine. We can accommodate it too. And so there's a healthy dose of pragmatism that goes along with this, a standards-based dogmatism of this, which I think is good.
Well, one of the final, maybe the final actually insight I wanted to bring up, you've sort of woven throughout this discussion about the pragmatism and the fact that without a business case to this, it doesn't really go anywhere, right? Multiple guests have emphasized this, and I'll even quote a few of them. Kevin McGee from Microsoft was talking about quantifying risk in probability ranges and dollar amounts, like actually getting really specific. Sean said, never let a good incident go to waste for funding. Eric talked about success meaning fewer roles, not more, and that's easier as you scale. And Jim and Jeff talked about something you mentioned too, in terms of political capital and organizational politics being often the biggest barrier. So it's clear that you need executive buy-in and clear business value. So how have you seen identity leaders successfully champion projects or continuous identity specifically to their businesses?
It's a couple ways it happens. One is, and I talked about this before, friend of the show who has that slide of like every logo out there. And he'll go and basically say like, you know what's really annoying about this that you know, business leader, security leader are annoyed about is that none of it works together, right? Right. Cool. What if we could fix that? Like for realsies. That sells itself in some regard, right? The idea to say, we have a variety of really great pieces of infrastructure that are domain specific, they're practice specific. If we could bring just the most salient pieces of that into our decision making, we can make better decisions. We could be faster to make those decisions. And what that translates into is less access related risk for the enterprise, less administrative burden. Like, let's get rid of approval processes where we don't need them. Let's get rid of access certifications where we don't need them. That, in his words, sells itself. And so I think part of it is that you've always needed a business case. Identity, more often than not, had to fall on pretty much 2 to 3 business cases. One is, we have a compliance obligation to do this because of Sarbanes-Oxley. That's one. 2 is, hey, there's a productivity need to provide single sign-on, and security has MFA requirements alongside of that. So we're going to do this as a productivity gain. Or the third one is cost avoidance. Essentially, we're going to roll out, say, passkeys and SSO because we're tired of paying $25 a help desk call for password reset. Those have been basically like the 3 business cases. But now I think it is the opportunity is to say like, look, there are very few greenfield environments, right? So where people are living with identity and security decisions from a decade ago, 2 decades ago. And the opportunity to say, we're living with these things, but we can make these pains associated with them just frankly go away while we are mitigating risk. We can reduce the time it takes for someone to get access to minutes, not days, productivity gain. We can avoid having standing access that can be abused, that we can then apply not only for our humans, our carbon-based life form, but our silicon-based life forms and our workforce, our workloads, and our NHIs, but do it once. Those are the kinds of things that actually people stand up and take notice about, right? And so a lot of the business case for continuous identity comes from talking about outcomes that can still be achieved better with less human in the middle, less human in the loop, less friction for everyone involved. And I think that's why people find it so compelling. It's from the business case side of things.
And I don't think it's too much to say. It's not much of a leap to explain that is really helping identity leaders to become business leaders and business enablers, and not just ticket closers or task managers. Is that fair to say?
The more we can get away from having that squad of people that just fill access request tickets, the better. Right? If we can use those same people to build policies that describe the conditions under which and when you need access, that's a better use of their time. And we're going to reduce help desk call volume, for example, right? And so we start to see identity leaders saying, we just can't keep doing what we've been doing. And because it's not a sustainable thing from a business perspective. It is not something that I can maintain the budget for, despite the reality of how important it is. And it's harder and harder to defend this infrastructure, right? And the access that it enables, we've got to find another path. And I think this is the way forward.
Great. I want to thank you for your time here, and as a bookend, the beginning. If we wrap up in the entirety of season 1, and maybe someone is going to binge all 9 episodes or 10, including this one, which, by the way, are available at signal.ai/sessions and on our YouTube channel on demand. What's one takeaway or sort of closing thought that you hope that they walk away with after binging everything, aside from being pretty sleep deprived, I assume, with going through 9 or 10 hours?
There's 10 action-packed episodes that are going to keep you up. So it's the first week of December in 2025. And we are roughly 25 years on from the Enron scandal and about 24 years on from Sarbanes-Oxley. In a lot of ways, we've been doing the same thing as identity practitioners since those days. And 25 years, that's a generation, right? That's how demographers measure what a generation is. So like, we're literally a generation, like your IGA deployment can rent a car now kind of thing. And so there's a palpable feeling that was happening this year. And I think throughout all of our guests, we heard this. Something's changing, right? That this continuous identity concept feels like what's going to be the identity practices for the coming 25 years, if we're so lucky. But it feels like what's next. And it feels like what's next without a discontinuous shift, meaning you don't have to like throw out everything, drop everything, and suddenly do this new thing. There's actually a gentle grade to get to what's more modern. And so I think the interesting thing is that we are in real need of that transitional period, because the humans that we have to manage and their access is one bucket of fun. We have our silicon-based life forms in workload and NHIs, and then we have the agentic side of things. And so these populations that we have to serve, these constituents, are only growing in number and at the speed at which they want to operate. And so this concept of continuous identity allows us to, I think, at least envision a way to serve all of those constituents, easy for me to say, at the speed that they want to operate versus at the speed our previous generation of identity practices held us to. And that's a profound difference. The important thing is that smooth grade between the two, so that we don't have this abrupt shift of like, you're going to roll into CISO's office and say, we're throwing it all out, and we're going to start fresh and, come back and check with me when it's done. Obviously, that's not going to fly. It's how do we improve our posture, reduce our access exposure, and along the way, start to serve some of these other constituencies even better than they've been served in the past. So I think if I was to say the wrap up, it's sort of the summation of the changes afoot comes just at the right time, that we know we need to, in some regards, pick up the pace how we serve all of the populations in our enterprise while mitigating risk. And that's happening. Like, that is actively happening, and that's really cool to see.
There you go. There it is. Thank you for the wrap up. Real quickly, before I kind of really close this out here, I think most of, if not all of our guests will be at the Gartner IAM Summit coming up in Texas next week. As you mentioned, Ian, when we record this, it's early December. I think you'll be there, correct? And any other place you'll be throughout the end of the year?
Atul will be there. He'll be on stage talking about Auth0 and some more. You're right. I think almost without exception, every single guest will be there. But the other thing I want to plug just at end of year is there is an amazing webinar series that ID Pro is putting on with Sean O'Dell and Andrew Cameron. And they're sort of redoing their workshop from Identiverse on continuous identity. And they broke it into 4 parts. Part 1 just came out. The next 3 parts are going to be mid-January, February. So something to put in your queue list, because this is going to drop. You're going to have 10 episodes of this you're going to want to watch instead of like hanging out with your family over Christmas time, and then go check out those things. So there's plenty of things to do and learn before the beginning of next year. And then once you get there, there's 3 more webinars from some really great practitioners talking about this topic too.
Amazing. Great tip. Thank you, Ian Glazer. Thanks to all our guests. I'm going to go through. Hopefully I don't forget anyone. Felix Gatkins, Darren Rolls, Eric Gustafson, Matt Hamlin, Jim McDonald, Jeff Stedman, Scott Kriz, Atul Tulsi-Begwali, Kevin McGee, Sean Odell, and Loy Robinson. The insights that have been shared here is really about how enterprises are thinking and implementing continuous identity. And thanks to the audience. Thanks to everybody who's been with us, listening, watching from episode 1 or discovered us along the way. As I mentioned, all 9, now 10 episodes are available on demand at signal.ai/sessions and on our YouTube channel. Bang that like and subscribe button. Also want to thank Signal and our folks behind the scenes, Nicole, who's our fearless leader, who's never on camera, but she's really running the show. And we will all be back in early 2026 with season 2, building on everything we've learned, exploring what comes next in the evolution of identity and security. For the holidays, happy everything. Until then, keep making identity work better and more continuous. We'll see you in season 2. Thanks so much.
See you, buddy.